What happens when the brain is denied the one thing it needs most? The answer is more terrifying than most people imagine. Sleep is one of the most ordinary parts of life. We do it every night without thinking. Yet it is also one of the most mysterious biological needs humans have ever known. We can survive weeks without food, days without water, but remove sleep long enough, and the mind begins to unravel. This question fascinated researchers for decades. What really happens when a person is denied sleep? How long can the brain remain stable? At what point does reality begin to break? In controlled studies, volunteers were kept awake under constant supervision. Bright lights filled the rooms. Staff monitored them through the night. Subjects were forced to stay active, talk, walk, read, or answer questions. The goal was simple: keep them awake at all costs. During the first 24 hours, most participants only appeared tired. They yawned more often. Their reaction time slowed. They laughed at small things. Concentration became difficult, but after 36 hours, the changes deepened. Speech became less organized. Mood swings increased. Irritation turned into anger with no warning. Simple tasks like counting backward or remembering short instructions became frustratingly hard. After 48 hours, some subjects reported strange sensations. Walls seemed to move. Shadows in the corner of the room looked alive. Sounds felt louder than normal. A quiet hallway could suddenly feel threatening. By the third day, reality itself could begin to blur. Some participants believed they saw insects crawling on surfaces that were completely clean. Others thought someone was standing behind them when no one was there. One subject reportedly became convinced his own reflection was another person watching him. Another forgot what experiment he had joined and repeatedly asked to go home. Researchers noticed something important. Lack of sleep does not only make people tired, it damages judgment. It weakens emotional control. It distorts memory. It increases fear. The human brain depends on sleep to reset itself. Without it, thoughts become unstable. Emotions become exaggerated. The boundary between imagination and reality grows thin. Military planners also studied sleep loss for darker reasons. If exhaustion weakens resistance, could it be used in interrogation? Could confusion make someone easier to control? These questions led to harsh methods in different parts of the world. Continuous lights, loud sounds, forced standing, repeated questioning, constant interruption whenever the subject began to drift asleep. But the results revealed a limit no system could escape. A human body pushed too far does not become obedient. It becomes unstable. Eventually, once subjects were allowed to sleep again, many recovered quickly. But some described lingering anxiety, headaches, confusion, and emotional distress long after the tests ended. Modern science now confirms what those experiments painfully demonstrated. Sleep is not laziness. It is maintenance for the brain itself. Every dreamless night we ignore may seem small, but without sleep, the human mind slowly turns against itself. No pain, no torture, no violence, just silence and a locked room. Yet many people broke faster than anyone expected. Most people fear darkness, not because darkness itself is dangerous, but because the human mind hates what it cannot understand. In darkness, imagination fills the empty space. In silence, the mind creates its own noise. And when a person is left alone long enough, even their own thoughts can become an enemy. This idea fascinated researchers who wanted to understand fear at its purest form. They asked a disturbing question. If a person is cut off from the outside world completely, what happens to the mind? To find out, subjects were placed inside isolation chambers. These rooms were designed to remove stimulation. Thick walls blocked sound. No windows allowed sunlight. No clocks marked time. No voices came from outside. Some rooms were barely larger than a closet. Others were concrete cells with a bed, a chair, and nothing more. At first, many subjects believed they could handle it easily. They entered calm, confident, even curious. Some treated it like a challenge. During the first hours, people often tried to create routines. They counted breaths, repeated songs in their heads, tapped patterns on walls, walked circles around the room, anything to measure time. But time behaves strangely in isolation. Without sunlight, clocks, or conversation, minutes feel like hours. Hours feel endless. After extended silence, the mind begins searching desperately for stimulation. Subjects reported hearing footsteps in hallways that were empty, whispers with no speaker, knocking sounds from walls that never moved. Some believed they heard their own name being called. Others became convinced someone was standing just outside the door. Researchers observed increasing anxiety, breathing quickened, pulse rates rose. Some subjects paced the room for hours, others froze in corners, refusing to move. Then came visual distortions. Shapes formed in darkness, faces appeared in shadows. Light flashes were seen with closed eyes. One participant claimed insects were crawling across the floor. Another insisted the walls were slowly moving inward. But perhaps the most disturbing effect was not hallucination. It was emotional collapse. Some subjects cried uncontrollably. Some became angry without knowing why. Others begged to speak to anyone at all. Human beings are social creatures. Even brief eye contact, a simple voice, or background sounds help anchor the mind in reality. Remove all of that, and reality becomes unstable. Military and intelligence groups later studied isolation for darker purposes. If silence and loneliness weaken resistance, could they be used in interrogation? Could a person be broken without leaving visible injuries? These methods became feared precisely because they often left no physical scars. Yet the psychological damage could be severe. Panic attacks, sleep problems, anxiety long after release, fear of confined spaces. Modern psychology now understands something these experiments revealed brutally. The human mind does not need pain to suffer. Sometimes emptiness is enough. A locked room, endless silence, no sense of time, no human voice. For many, that was more terrifying than violence itself. What if the most powerful weapon in history wasn't a bomb, but the ability to control what someone thinks? During the Cold War, fear spread far beyond the battlefield. Nations were no longer only afraid of bombs or armies. They feared something invisible: control of the human mind. Rumors circulated that enemy powers had discovered methods of brainwashing. Stories emerged of prisoners confessing strange things, soldiers changing loyalties, and people acting against their own beliefs. Whether true, exaggerated, or misunderstood, the effect was the same: panic. Intelligence agencies began asking a dangerous question. If another nation could control minds, could we do it first? That question launched secret research programs focused on one objective: breaking, reshaping, and controlling human behavior. Behind closed doors, researchers studied hypnosis, memory disruption, chemical influence, extreme stress, sensory deprivation, repetition under exhaustion. The dream was ambitious. Could a person be made to reveal secrets unwillingly? Could memories be blurred or replaced? Could fear make someone obedient? Could loyalty be erased and rewritten? Some subjects entered willingly, believing they were part of harmless medical research. Others had little idea what was happening to them. In certain cases, participants were deceived entirely. Chemicals were sometimes introduced to study confusion, suggestibility, and altered perception. Under their effects, subjects were questioned repeatedly. Their reactions were observed and documented. Some laughed uncontrollably, some panicked, some became deeply paranoid, others withdrew into silence. Researchers also tested sleep deprivation. A tired mind becomes easier to influence. Exhausted people struggle to focus, resist pressure, or separate truth from suggestion. Interrogation rooms were designed to increase stress, bright lights, endless questioning, no sense of time, isolation between sessions. In hypnosis studies, subjects were guided into trance states and given commands. Investigators wanted to know whether hidden instructions could remain after waking. Could someone obey later without remembering why? Most serious findings were disappointing. Human minds proved far more complex than planners imagined. People are not machines with simple switches. Memory cannot be neatly edited like text on paper. Loyalty cannot be reliably programmed on command. But while the results were weak, the consequences were real. Some participants later described lasting anxiety. Others struggled with trust, confusion, or emotional distress. Declassified files shocked the public decades later, not because secret mind control had succeeded, but because respected institutions were willing to try. The greatest illusion was not control over others. It was the belief that power could master something as complex as consciousness itself. In the end, many programs discovered a truth they did not expect. The more force used against the mind, the less predictable it becomes. Fear creates resistance. Trauma creates damage. Chaos creates chaos. And the human mind, even under pressure, remains far less controllable than those in power hoped. What if the most dangerous people are not monsters, but ordinary people given power and no consequences? Most people believe cruelty comes from evil individuals, that violence requires monsters, that abuse is committed only by those who were always dangerous. But one controversial experiment challenged that belief with a far more disturbing idea. What if ordinary people can become cruel simply because a system allows it? Researchers wanted to study the psychology of power, obedience, and identity. They gathered healthy volunteers with no serious criminal backgrounds. Many were students, normal people, friendly people, people who likely never imagined themselves in positions of abuse. They were randomly assigned roles. Some became guards, others became prisoners. It seemed simple at first, a simulation, temporary roles in a controlled environment. But the human mind often treats symbols as reality. Uniforms matter, locked doors matter, titles matter, permission matters. Guards were given authority. Prisoners were stripped of privacy and routine. Numbers replaced names. Orders replaced choice. At the beginning, many participants laughed. They treated the situation like a game. But games can change once power feels real. Within a short time, some guards became increasingly aggressive. They shouted commands, created arbitrary punishments, forced compliance over minor issues. Some prisoners resisted. Others became quiet and withdrawn. Stress spread rapidly through the group. Researchers observed something unsettling. People often adapt faster to roles than expected. A guard who entered as a calm student could begin acting harshly after receiving authority. A prisoner who entered confident could become passive after repeated humiliation. Why? Because systems shape behavior. When one group is rewarded for dominance, dominance grows. When another group loses control, helplessness grows. Small acts escalated. Orders became louder. Punishments became more degrading. Sleep was disrupted. Tension became constant. Some participants showed signs of emotional breakdown, anxiety attacks, crying, anger, detachment. The simulation, intended to last much longer, had to be stopped early. But the most disturbing lesson was not what happened inside the prison. It was how quickly it happened. In only a short period, normal people began reflecting the structure around them. Critics later argued the study had flaws. Some questioned methods, pressure, and realism. Those debates continue. Yet even with controversy, the central warning remains powerful. Environments influence behavior more than many people realize. History shows this outside laboratories too, in wars, in abusive institutions, in corrupt systems. People do not need to wake up evil to commit harm. Sometimes they only need a badge, permission, and a room where no one stops them. That may be one of the most frightening truths of all, because if cruelty belongs only to monsters, we can spot it easily. But if cruelty can emerge from ordinary people under the wrong conditions, then society must be far more careful than it likes to believe. Some experiments didn't need chains or prisons. All they needed was something hidden in a drink. Not every dangerous experiment used chains, locked rooms, or visible force. Some of the most disturbing tests entered the body quietly, through a pill, an injection, a drink, or the air itself. Chemical exposure experiments were built on a cold question. How does the human body react under conditions it never agreed to face? Researchers wanted data. Governments wanted military advantages. Some institutions wanted to understand fear, pain, endurance, memory, and performance. But for many subjects, the experiment began before they even knew it had started. In some cases, people were told they were receiving harmless treatment. Others believed they were volunteering for routine medical studies. Some were never properly informed at all. Once exposed, reactions could begin slowly. A strange taste in the mouth, mild dizziness, dry throat, sweaty palms. Then stronger symptoms followed. Racing heartbeat, confusion, nausea, trembling hands, difficulty focusing. Subjects often looked around the room, unsure whether something was wrong with them or with the environment. Certain substances were studied for how they altered alertness. Could exhaustion be delayed? Could fear be reduced? Could pain be ignored long enough for soldiers to continue? Others were tested for the opposite reasons. Could confusion be increased? Could memory weaken? Could decision-making collapse under pressure? Some experiments focused on dosage. How much is too little to matter? How much begins to impair judgment? How much becomes dangerous? But human bodies do not respond like identical machines. One subject might remain calm. Another could panic from the same amount. One might feel only fatigue. Another might experience terror. This unpredictability made the experiments both revealing and reckless. Witnesses described participants staring blankly at walls. Others laughed uncontrollably. Some became suspicious of everyone around them. A few reportedly believed they were dying. In controlled notes, these reactions were often reduced to neat language: elevated distress, temporary paranoia, disorientation. But behind those words were real human experiences. Panic feels real. Fear feels real. Losing control of your own mind feels terrifyingly real. Some researchers also studied long-term exposure. What happens after repeated contact? Does the body adapt? Does the mind change? Do subtle symptoms appear months later? In many historical cases, answers were incomplete because records were hidden, destroyed, or never honestly kept. Public outrage grew strongest when people learned consent had been ignored. The danger was not only the chemical itself, it was the decision that someone else could choose that risk for another person. Modern ethics standards now require transparency, informed consent, safety review, and the right to withdraw. Those protections were written because earlier generations lacked them. Chemical experiments revealed an uncomfortable truth. Science can measure reactions, but once empathy disappears, people become variables on a chart. And history shows how dangerous that mindset can become. Cold can make you feel calm while you're dying. Heat can make you confused before you collapse. Researchers wanted to know exactly when both begin. The human body is built for balance. A narrow internal temperature range keeps the heart beating, the brain functioning, and every organ working in harmony. Move too far below that range, and systems begin to fail. Move too far above it, and the same thing happens. This made temperature one of the most dangerous subjects ever studied in human experimentation. Researchers wanted answers to brutal questions. How long can a person survive freezing cold? How quickly does confusion begin? Can someone be revived after severe hypothermia? How much heat can the body endure before collapse? In wartime and military settings, these questions were often justified as preparation. Pilots could crash into icy water, soldiers could be stranded in snow. Workers could face extreme desert heat. But behind that practical language, many tests crossed the line into cruelty. In cold exposure studies, subjects were placed in freezing rooms or immersed in icy water. At first came violent shivering. Teeth chattered uncontrollably, muscles tightened, hands lost coordination. Then the more dangerous stage began. Shivering slowed, speech slurred, fingers became numb, thoughts became foggy. This is what makes extreme cold deceptive. It can feel urgent at first, then strangely quiet. Victims may feel sleepy, calm, or confused just as the body is failing. Some reportedly removed clothing despite the cold, a phenomenon linked to severe hypothermia and mental disorientation. Others became unable to understand simple instructions. Researchers timed reactions, measured pulse, and monitored body temperature as if observing a machine under stress. Heat exposure tests revealed a different kind of danger. Subjects were placed in overheated chambers or forced to continue activity under punishing temperatures. Sweat poured rapidly. Breathing accelerated. The heart worked harder to cool the body. But when heat overwhelms cooling systems, symptoms escalate fast. Dizziness, nausea, headache, cramping muscles, loss of coordination. In severe cases, confusion appears, one of the most dangerous warning signs. A person suffering heat stress may stop recognizing the risk entirely. Researchers hope to discover survival limits, rescue methods, protective clothing strategies, and endurance thresholds. Some useful knowledge eventually came from safer modern science, but earlier methods often came at unacceptable human cost. What these experiments revealed is simple and humbling. Human beings are not designed to conquer nature indefinitely. We survive through shelter, clothing, fire, water, rest, and community. Strip those away, and even the strongest body becomes fragile. Cold steels function slowly. Heat overwhelms suddenly. Both can turn judgment against the victim. Modern emergency medicine now treats temperature injury with far more ethics and care. But history remembers the era when some chose to learn these lessons through suffering. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: nature does not negotiate. The body has limits, whether power respects them or not. Most people think they would refuse to hurt someone, but what if an expert calmly told them to continue? Most people like to believe they would refuse an immoral order, that if asked to harm another person, they would immediately say no. That conscience would always be stronger than pressure. But psychologists wanted to test a deeply uncomfortable question: how far will ordinary people go when an authority figure tells them to continue? In one of the most famous obedience studies in history, participants believed they were helping with a learning experiment. They were introduced to another person in the next room. Their role seemed simple: ask questions and deliver electric shocks whenever answers were wrong. The machine looked real. It had switches arranged in increasing levels. Labels suggested danger as the levels rose. Buzzers clicked, lights flashed. The design was meant to feel official, technical, unquestionable. At first, participants hesitated only slightly. A wrong answer. A small switch pressed. Nothing dramatic. Then the levels increased. From the next room came sounds of discomfort. protests, pleas to stop, silence at higher levels. Many participants turned nervously toward the researcher. They laughed from stress, sweated visibly, shook their heads, asked whether they should continue. And each time the authority figure responded calmly, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue." Those simple phrases carried enormous psychological weight. A lab coat, a university setting, scientific language, confidence. Together, they created legitimacy. Many participants obeyed far longer than they expected of themselves. Not because they were sadistic, not because they enjoyed causing pain, but because responsibility felt transferred upward. If the expert says continue, maybe it must be safe. If the institution approves, maybe I am not accountable. If I stop, maybe I am the problem. This is the trap of authority. It can silence personal judgment without force. Some participants were visibly distressed. Trembling hands hovered over switches, voices cracked, faces showed panic. Yet many continued while emotionally suffering themselves. The study's real target was never electricity. It was obedience. Researchers wanted to understand how atrocities in the real world become possible, how soldiers, officials, guards, and workers can participate in harm while believing they are simply following orders. The answer was disturbing. Extreme evil does not always require hatred. Sometimes it requires hierarchy, distance from the victim, and permission from above. Critics later debated ethics, emotional stress, and deception used in the study. Those concerns remain important, but its warning endures. Authority can be useful. It organizes hospitals, schools, emergency response, and daily life. But when authority goes unquestioned, conscience can slowly disappear. The lesson is not that people are naturally cruel. It is that many people are more obedient than they realize. And history repeatedly shows what can happen when obedience replaces morality. What if you heard nothing, saw nothing, felt almost nothing, and your own mind became the loudest thing in the room? The human brain never truly rests while awake. Even in silence, it listens. Even in darkness, it searches. Even when alone, it constantly processes signals from the world around it. Sound, light, temperature, gravity, touch, motion. These invisible streams of information keep the mind anchored in reality. But what happens when nearly all of them are removed? This question led researchers to sensory deprivation experiments. Their goal was simple but unsettling. Place a person in an environment with minimal external stimulation and observe what happens to the mind. Some subjects were placed in specially designed chambers. Others floated in tanks filled with warm salt water, allowing the body to drift effortlessly. The water matched skin temperature so closely that boundaries between body and environment began to fade. Inside these tanks, there was no light, no sound, no pressure points from sitting or standing, almost no sense of movement. At first, many participants described relief, peace, calm breathing, deep relaxation. For some, it felt like escaping the noise of life itself. But for others, the experience changed quickly. Without outside signals, the mind began generating its own. Fleeting lights appeared in darkness. Geometric shapes drifted across closed eyes. Distant voices seemed to form from silence. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Strange emotions arrived without warning. Minutes became difficult to measure. Some thought an hour had passed when only 10 minutes had gone by. Others believed they had floated briefly, only to learn much longer time had passed. Time depends heavily on change. Without change, the mind loses one of its clocks. Some subjects reported a fading sense of body boundaries. Where do your hands end if you cannot feel pressure? Where does the room begin if you cannot hear space around you? This could feel peaceful or deeply unsettling. One participant described feeling as though they were expanding into the room. Another felt they were shrinking into a single point. Some experienced racing thoughts. Others encountered emotional memories they had avoided for years. Researchers became interested for many reasons. Could deprivation increase suggestibility? Could it help therapy? Could it reveal hidden mental processes? Could it train focus? Different groups saw different uses. Scientists studied cognition. Military planners considered endurance and interrogation relevance. Wellness communities later explored relaxation benefits. But one truth remained consistent. The human brain does not simply switch off when deprived of input. It becomes active in new ways. When the world grows quiet, the mind grows louder. Modern float tanks are often used safely for stress relief under voluntary conditions, but historical experiments showed how powerful the environment can be when sensation is reduced too far or imposed without care. We tend to think reality comes only from outside us, yet these studies suggested something more complex. Reality is also constructed inside the mind, moment by moment, using signals we rarely notice until they disappear. Remove enough of those signals, and the mind begins to create a world of its own. What if someone could weaken your mind, not to help you, but to see what you would reveal? Throughout history, power has always searched for shortcuts, faster obedience, easier truth, less resistance. This desire led some researchers to a dangerous idea. What if chemicals could make the human mind more suggestible? Could a person become easier to influence under altered states? Could fear weaken? Could secrets be revealed? Could loyalty be reshaped? These questions inspired a series of controversial drug suggestion trials. In controlled rooms, subjects were given substances designed to alter awareness, perception, or emotional state. Sometimes they knew they were participating in research. Sometimes they understood very little about what they were receiving. Once effects began, the environment became part of the experiment. Lighting, tone of voice, repeated questions, isolation, authority figures nearby. Researchers knew that influence is rarely caused by one factor alone. It often comes from chemistry, stress, confusion, and social pressure working together. Some subjects became unusually talkative. Thoughts spilled out rapidly and without structure. Minor memories felt urgent and important. Random ideas sounded meaningful. Others became suspicious. They questioned every face in the room, every sound outside the door, every note written by observers. Some laughed uncontrollably. Others became fearful. A few withdrew into silence and stared at the floor for long periods. Investigators repeated questions in different ways. They watched whether suggestions were accepted more easily, whether confidence dropped, whether contradictions increased. But altered states often produce unreliable information. Confused minds do not necessarily tell truth. They may mix memory with imagination, fear with fantasy, suggestion with belief. This was one of the central failures of such experiments. A vulnerable mind can become more expressive, but not more accurate. Some participants later struggled to describe what happened. Time felt broken. Minutes stretched strangely. Emotional reactions seemed detached from reason. For some, the most disturbing part was not the chemical itself. It was realizing someone else had intentionally weakened their mental control to study what followed. Documents and testimonies later raised serious ethical concerns: informed consent, psychological harm, misuse of authority. The false belief that minds could be opened like locked doors. In reality, the human mind is not a safe with one combination. It is layered, emotional, defensive, contradictory, and deeply shaped by context. Under pressure, people may speak more, but more words do not mean more truth. These trials revealed a lesson still relevant today. Whenever someone promises a perfect shortcut into another person's mind, skepticism is wise, because minds are not conquered through chemistry. They are often damaged by the attempt. The darkest experiments rarely target the strongest. They target those who cannot say no. The most disturbing experiments in history often share one pattern. They target those least able to resist: prisoners, the poor, the isolated, the forgotten, and in some cases, children. Few subjects are more vulnerable than a child placed inside an institution. A child depends on adults for food, safety, truth, and protection. When those same adults misuse authority, the damage can reach far beyond the moment itself. Throughout the 20th century, various institutions around the world, schools, orphanages, hospitals, reform homes, and care facilities became places where questionable studies were carried out. Sometimes these studies were framed as progress: nutrition research, behavioral observation, medical testing, development tracking. But behind careful language, some children were treated less like individuals and more like data. In crowded dormitories and rigid systems, children often had little voice. They could not meaningfully consent. They often did not understand what was happening, and they rarely had anyone powerful enough to defend them. In certain cases, diets were manipulated to study deficiency or growth. In others, routines were altered to observe emotional response, discipline, stress, or obedience. Some underwent medical procedures or testing without standards that would later become mandatory. Even when physical harm was limited, emotional harm could be profound. Imagine being young and uncertain, watched constantly, measured constantly, corrected constantly. Imagine not knowing whether an injection is treatment or research, whether a rule exists for your safety or for someone's notes. Children learn trust by depending on caregivers. When care becomes control, confusion enters the foundation of identity itself. Some survivors later described long-lasting effects: difficulty trusting authority, anxiety in medical settings, shame, fear of institutions, emotional distance. Others remembered less specific events but carried persistent unease for years. Trauma does not always return as a clear memory. Sometimes it returns as patterns: fear, withdrawal, hypervigilance, silence. Defenders of past systems often used familiar arguments. Standards were different then. They meant well. It helped future generations. But ethical progress requires honesty. Good intentions do not erase exploitation. Benefits do not erase lack of consent. Efficiency does not erase dignity. Public revelations of institutional abuse and unethical studies helped transform modern law and research ethics. New protections emphasized informed consent, guardianship standards, review boards, transparency, and special safeguards for minors. These reforms exist because children once lacked them. This chapter is difficult because it reveals something deeper than scientific misconduct. It reveals how easily society can overlook suffering when it happens behind closed doors, inside respectable buildings, under official names. White walls do not guarantee morality. Uniforms do not guarantee care. Records do not guarantee truth. The final lesson is simple and timeless. The measure of any society is how it treats those with the least power. When children are protected, institutions deserve trust. When children are used, every claim of progress becomes suspect. And that is why some of history's darkest experiments are remembered not for what they discovered, but for whom they failed.